In addition to self-administered surveys, another standard way of collecting data is through in-person surveys. These can take the form of focus groups or one-on-one interviews. The data collected via these methods are qualitative rather than quantitative. So, unlike quantitative data, which deals with numbers and can be measured, as in the case of questionnaires with rating scales, for example, qualitative data is descriptive. It can be observed but not measured. So let's begin by looking at focus groups. Focus groups are moderator-led open discussions among a small number of homogeneous participants who are a representative sampling of the target audience you wish to reach. Focus groups can be used to ask participants a number of open-ended questions on user needs or experiences. They can also be used to solicit very specific feedback on a particular product or service you are considering offering. And an example of this is a commercial vendor who conducts focus groups at national library conferences as a way of gathering feedback on new products or a potential interface redesign of an existing product. As another example, a few years ago, Cornell University and Columbia University undertook a joint grant-funded study of graduate students in the humanities at both institutions. The purpose of the study was to determine if libraries could help reverse the ever-increasing attrition rate of these students. As part of the study, one-on-one interviews and focus groups were set up. The libraries targeted students in several academic disciplines by sharing email announcements with the department chairs and administrative assistants in each academic department the libraries targeted. Questions were then drawn up using 3 distinct categories, which we'll discuss later. So, some best practices for focus groups. When planning a focus group session, the number of participants should be neither too small, thereby running the risk of a discussion not being very useful, nor too large, which runs the risk of some people being left out of the discussion. So size-wise, the ideal size is around 6 to 10 individuals. And then the length of the session. When determining the amount of time to allocate to a focus group, you want to ensure that there's enough time for all participants to have a chance to speak. At the same time, if the session lasts too long, participants may run out of energy and interest. So ideally, focus group sessions should last between about 45 and 90 minutes. And then there's the number of questions. As with survey questionnaires, you must be careful to not inundate the participants with too many questions. In the case of focus groups, it's best to limit the session to about 8 to 10 questions. So some tips for conducting the session itself. First of all, start on time. So first and foremost, start the session on time, even if some participants have not yet arrived. You don't want to waste people's time by waiting for tardy participants. And you should also draft a timeline to follow. That will help you keep on time. Explain the process. Welcome participants and thank them for attending. Remind participants of the purpose of the focus group. Reiterate that their participation is completely voluntary and that they should feel free to leave at any time. Explain how the process will work and ask if there are any questions. Next, introductions. Ask participants to introduce themselves by providing a very brief background as it applies to the focus group. For example, if you're conducting a focus group of gym members, you might start with asking the participants to introduce themselves and state how long they've been a gym member, that kind of thing. And then the ground rules. So review the rules of civil discourse, including no interrupting and no disrespectful language. Also assure participants that their comments will be kept in confidence by those running the focus group, and ask participants to respect the confidentiality of others. Refreshments. Along with a monetary incentive, food often attracts people to focus groups, and we've seen this time and again. So if you can, offer some refreshments. All right, so now let's talk about focus group questions. The questions you pose during a focus group can be broken into 3 broad categories. Engagement. And these are the questions that you open with in order to introduce the participants to the topic and to make them feel comfortable. So, for example, when we conducted focus groups for the graduate student attrition study, our introductory question was, why did you choose to study at Cornell? Exploration. The exploration questions are open-ended and serve as a vehicle for getting to the heart of the matter. Using the Cornell example again, these questions would include, what is going well for you in your graduate program? What has not worked well for you in your graduate program? What role has the library played thus far in your graduate career? You'll also want to probe more deeply if responses are vague. So, for example, what do you usually do when you're at the library? How many hours a week do you spend at the library? How conducive do you find Cornell libraries to accomplishing your work? And if you had to list the top 3 things that the library could do to support your advancement in your graduate program, what would they be? And then finally, exit. So the exit questions are really meant to determine if there was anything the interview otherwise missed. In this case, questions could include, is there any other assistance that the library could provide that would help you in your graduate program? Is there anything additional you would like to mention? That kind of thing. So these 3 categories of questions can also be applied to one-on-one interviews. Okay, what are some advantages of focus groups? Well, you have face-to-face interactions, right? So unlike an anonymous survey, you can actually have a discussion with participants. You can also gauge verbal and nonverbal cues, as well as emotional responses, the extent to which a particular issue or a topic resonates with the respondent. You get a range of opinions and experiences. So although you're dealing with a homogeneous group, nonetheless, you get a wide range of opinions from focus groups. So you're going to get a lot of different opinions and experiences coming in. And then there's group dynamics. The group dynamics of a focus group often stimulates thoughts and discussions. So one person's comments will often cause another person to react or to think of something that they hadn't thought of before. And thereby it sort of invigorates the discussion. It helps keeping the discussion really invigorated and going. And then there's the ability to probe. If an answer is ambiguous or not clear, you can probe more deeply for details. So what are some disadvantages of focus groups? Well, there are some. It's time consuming, right? So unlike a self-administered survey questionnaire, a focus group is very time consuming. In addition to drafting solicitations to participate, coordination, logistics, and administration, all of these things include reserving rooms, scheduling participants, obtaining institutional review board clearance, and we'll discuss that a bit later, attending the focus group, recording and transcribing participant comments. So it is definitely time consuming. And it involves at least 2 staff members. So it's standard practice to have 2 staff members oversee the focus group, one to moderate the discussion and the other to act as a recorder. It is also a good idea to have a 3rd staff member as a stand-in the event that one of the scheduled staff members is unexpectedly unable to attend the session. Obtaining institutional review board clearance, I mentioned this just a second ago. So if your library is part of a university or other large organization, you may be required to submit your survey proposal to an institutional review board. And this is usually standard practice for any studies involving human subjects. Equipment may be needed. While focus groups always have a staff member serving as a recorder for the session, it is usually standard practice to digitally record the session as well. And this is done for the sake of accuracy, since it's often difficult for one person to adequately capture the entire discussion. Definitely more costly than survey questionnaires. In addition to the costs associated with staff time, it's often standard that a monetary incentive, such as cash or a small gift certificate, These are offered to participants who volunteer to take part in the focus group. That's pretty standard. And then the moderator must be skilled in managing discussions. And this is really very important. The individual moderating the discussion must be well trained in discussion facilitation. When Cornell and Columbia held focus groups and interviews for their graduate student study, staff participating in the study were specially trained in interview methodology. Moderators must also be able to keep the discussion on track, to encourage participation from all attendees, to ensure respectful dialogue, and to manage attendees who try to dominate the discussion. So you do have to be skilled at this. Some participants may be hesitant to speak up. And while a focus group can be great for stimulating ideas, it can also be uncomfortable for the individual who is naturally quiet or timid. Now, we don't usually run into this problem too often because in the case of focus groups, these individuals are self-selecting into a group discussion situation. So hopefully you won't get that too often, but I have seen it happen on occasion. And related to this, there may be a higher degree of response bias, that tendency for a participant to answer questions untruthfully due to a perceived pressure to provide a socially acceptable response. So that can happen as well. All right, now let's talk about the one-on-one interview. One-on-one interviews can take two forms. The first is the real-time interview. And this type of interview is usually a very short, usually 3 to 4 questions, and it's on the spot. So an example of this might be an election exit poll. This type of interview can be useful if you really want real-time feedback immediately after an event. For example, if your library has hosted a speaker or just delivered a program, you can stop users as they're leaving to gather very quick feedback on their opinion of the program, as opposed to asking them to fill in a survey that may never get returned. Another use for this type of interview is to gather some quick general information from users as they're leaving the library. So, for example, you might ask, before today, when is the last time you visited the library? What was your primary reason for visiting the library today? And, did you use the self-checkout machines today? Now, these are obviously just questions I made up as examples. What you're actually going to ask will be determined, obviously, by your specific needs. And then the other form of the one-on-one interview is a scheduled interview. And this is usually a more formal process that involves soliciting participants and then setting up a time to meet with them individually. So, best practices of one-on-one interviews. First of all, be prepared. The formal one-on-one interview will necessitate a good deal of advanced planning, similar to that of setting up a focus group. Preparation will include sending out solicitations, deciding on compensation, if any, if you're compensating the attendees, drafting questions, and reserving meeting rooms, that kind of thing. It involves 2 staff members. So again, although we call this the one-on-one interview, in reality, you should have 2 staff members in the interview, one to conduct the interview and the other to act as a recorder. And speaking of recorders, it is usually a good idea to rely on a digital recorder as well as someone taking notes. So just like the focus groups, it's good to have that backup. And then make the participant feel comfortable. The one-on-one interview format can sometimes make participants feel a little ill at ease. So avoid this situation by presenting a friendly and welcoming environment. Thank the participant for volunteering. Have light refreshments on hand. Keep the tone conversational rather than that of a formal interview. So put them at their ease. So what are some advantages of the one-on-one interview? Well, again, that face-to-face interaction, right? So this is really the biggest advantage of any in-person interview. The ability to read the participant's facial expressions and body language can be very telling. The ability to probe more deeply when asking questions and to clarify the questions you are asking. These are also real advantages of this type of interview. A one-on-one interaction also gives participants a greater sense that their opinion is valued due to the fact that they've been expressly chosen for a personal interview. The one-on-one interview is also really suited to certain personality types. So, some people are more expressive verbally. So having this option, whether as a one-on-one or focus group interaction, is always a good strategy. And related to personality types, there are individuals who are not comfortable sharing their opinions in a group, but who would be happy to do so in a more private setting, such as a one-on-one interview. Some disadvantages of the one-on-one interviews. Again, time-consuming. So, as I mentioned earlier, you should be prepared to devote the requisite time to carry out these one-on-one interviews. And this is really important because there are so many moving parts to consider here. And as with focus groups, the process is time-consuming and it's obviously much more costly than conducting survey questionnaires. Again, the need for training. So as I mentioned previously when we discussed focus groups, facilitator training is necessary in order for this process to really be successful. You really need the facilitator to know what they're doing. Interview bias. This is a particular area for which anyone conducting face-to-face interviews must be aware. In addition to assuring that the wording of questions do not lead participants in a certain direction, and we're going to see an example of this later, the interviewer must be extremely vigilant regarding his or her tone of voice and body language. So maintain open and neutral facial expressions and body language. So be open and watch your body language. Don't react with surprise, disgust, or agreement, irrespective of how a participant responds to a question. Definitely don't scowl or frown. You want to stay very neutral. Formality. By its very nature, the one-on-one interview can feel a bit formal. And that's why it's so important to ensure that the participant feels at ease throughout the process. Reiterate that the participation is completely voluntary and that the participant can refuse to answer a question and can terminate the interview at any time. All right, so here are some best practices for all types of survey tools. First of all, keep it simple. A basic rule of thumb when drafting survey questions is to keep the language clear and simple. So use everyday language as opposed to complex words or phrases. So for example, instead of asking, how friendly do you find the library's website interface, rewrite the question so it reads, how easy is it to find what you need on the library website? And avoid jargon, acronyms, and abbreviations. And again, this is a continuation of that keep it simple rule. We often use acronyms and jargon, and remember, your users do not necessarily share a common technical language with you, so be aware of that. Avoid asking leading questions. So don't structure a question that starts with a leading phrase or word. And I'd like an example that I found recently for this. So instead of asking, how short do you think Napoleon was? Ask instead, how would you describe Napoleon's height? In this way, you're removing the word short, which is already leading the respondent to think in a certain way. Manage expectations. Avoid asking questions that may cause respondents to develop unrealistic expectations. So for instance, when asking a respondent which days of the week they would like to use the library, do not list Saturday or Sunday if you have no intention of being open on weekends. If you use weekend days in your choice of responses, participants may erroneously infer that you may be thinking of changing the days that you're open to include weekends. Test your questions. Once you've created your survey questions, you should test them out on a few volunteers who are not involved in the survey creation process. This step ensures that your questions are clear and understandable to participants who are taking the survey or participating in a focus group or one-on-one interviews. So test your questions. Now, the one survey method we didn't discuss here is the phone interview. And these are often used, again, when collecting data. As it's not a survey methods course that I'm teaching here, I've only provided a brief introduction to some standard ways of gathering user feedback. If you're interested in delving further into focus groups and interviews, Library Juice Academy offers an entire course devoted to this topic. All right, so I just want to say a final word on surveys here. The very act of surveying users is in and of itself a form of marketing. Often we ask questions about products or services for which our users were not aware. And a case in point is an academic library that asked graduate student instructors if they took advantage of the library's instruction workshops for the undergraduate classes taught by graduate students. If the response was no, a follow-up question asked why the respondent had not availed himself or herself of this service. And in 56% of the cases, the respondents were not even aware that this service existed. So, while this data told the library that it needed to do a much better job of marketing in-class instructional services, the use of the question itself instantly raised awareness amongst the respondents that such a service even existed. That's how they learned the service existed.